It started like any ordinary lunch hour. Sunlight filtered through the windows of a trendy downtown restaurant in Atlanta. The clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversations, and the constant shuffle of servers created the usual symphony of urban dining. And then he walked in. A black man, maybe in his early 40s. He wore a plain red polo shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. No expensive watch, no designer cologne. Just him and a calm presence that didn't fit the noise around him. He asked for a table. And that's when it began. The hostess looked him up and down. Not just a glance, a scan. The kind that slices through your soul and evaluates your worth, not based on who you are, but what you look like. She smiled thinly. "I'm sorry, sir. We're fully booked for lunch." Behind him, a white couple walked in, dressed smart but not flashy. They asked for a table. The same hostess smiled, grabbed 2 menus and said, "Right this way." He saw it. So did I. Everyone saw it, but most pretended not to. He stood for a moment. You could tell he wanted to say something. You could see the frustration rising behind his calm exterior, the kind of quiet anger that comes from years of being told, "You don't belong here." But he simply nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. He walked outside, stood on the sidewalk, looked up at the restaurant sign. For a second, just a flicker of something passed across his face, something ancient. Not rage, not sadness, something older than that. Maybe it was weariness, maybe it was calculation. Inside, the hostess chuckled to the bartender. I mean, seriously. He didn't look like he could even afford the lunch special. The bartender laughed, unaware the man was still right outside the window, hands in his pockets, watching. You could feel something building. A storm, quiet, controlled, but inevitable. The next day he came back. Same shirt, same jeans, same quiet demeanor. But this time he wasn't alone. A young woman, sharply dressed, flanked him, clipboard in hand, Bluetooth headset flashing. A suited man followed, briefcase in tow, and behind them, a photographer. Not paparazzi professional, documentary style. The hostess looked up, confused. "Can I help you?" The man smiled politely. "I'd like to speak to your general manager." She blinked. "He's not available right now." "No worries," he said, and glanced to the woman beside him. She tapped her headset and spoke quietly into her mic. Within minutes, the general manager emerged from the back, clearly summoned in haste. He looked at the man and frowned, unsure. Yes, and that's when it happened. The man calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather card holder. From it, he drew a single black business card embossed in silver. He handed it to the manager, who read it, then blinked, read it again. His face drained of color. "Sir." "I didn't know." "No," the man interrupted gently. "You didn't." Silence fell over the room. Customers stopped eating. Forks hovered midair. Every head turned toward the quiet man in the plain red shirt. "I'm Harold Lawson," he continued, "chairman of the board that owns this restaurant group. We have 37 locations across the Southeast. And yesterday, I was denied service here." You could hear a pin drop. The hostess stood frozen behind the counter, her mouth slightly open. Harold turned to the photographer, who snapped a photo, not of the hostess, but of Harold standing under the restaurant's logo, his presence speaking louder than any words ever could. Then he turned back to the manager. "I'd like to speak to the staff now. All of them. Please." And in that moment, the moment before the reckoning, everyone realized something crucial. This wasn't a random customer. This was the man who writes the checks. And they had tried to humiliate him. There's a particular kind of silence that settles when power enters the room. Not loud, not chaotic, but charged like static before lightning strikes. Harold Lawson stood there, still wearing that red shirt, still calm. But now the entire restaurant was shifting in atmosphere. The air had changed. Staff were gathered. The general manager had reluctantly called them up front as requested. Some stood awkwardly with trays in hand. Others leaned against the wall. Among them, the hostess from the day before, her expression tight, calculating like she was trying to spin the narrative before it spun her. And Harold, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He didn't lecture. He told a story. Yesterday I came in as a regular man. Hungry, nothing more. I wasn't dressed to impress. I wasn't trying to draw attention. But I was profiled. I was looked up and down and told without a single check of the books that the place was fully booked. 5 minutes later, someone who looked different walked in and was seated with a smile. That is a pattern, a dangerous one. And it ends today. He paused, looked around. The young woman with the clipboard beside him scribbled notes. The suited man nodded, as if logging every response. The hostess, red-faced, spoke up suddenly. I didn't know who you were. He held up a hand. That's exactly the point. You didn't know. You made assumptions, not based on who I am, but on what I looked like. Let me ask you this. If I had been a working-class black man on lunch break from construction or janitorial work, would I not deserve respect? Silence. You could see the words land like stones. The staff shifted uncomfortably, but Harold wasn't finished. He walked slowly past them. Not with anger, with purpose. What I wear doesn't define my worth, and the way you treat a stranger that says more about your business than any 5-star Yelp review ever could. And then, with the weight of the room hanging heavy, he turned back to the manager. Is this how you train your team? Is this how your leadership operates? Based on looks, on race, on assumption. The manager, sweating, now tried to offer excuses. It must have been a mistake, sir. A misunderstanding. We never meant. But Harold wasn't here for backpedaling. He nodded to the suited man who calmly handed the manager a sealed envelope. That's an internal audit order, Harold explained. We'll be conducting a full review of this location's hiring, training, and service protocols, starting today. The room froze again. A few staffers looked at each other in shock, and then, for the first time, Harold's eyes narrowed not in anger, but with razor clarity. Let me be clear. This is not about me. This is about every single black man or woman who's been denied basic human decency simply because they didn't look like they belonged. I've been that man. In college, in corporate America, in country clubs, and I've watched it happen to others in silence. But now silence is complicity. And I didn't climb all the way up just to watch this mess play out at the doorstep of my own business. The temperature in the room had risen tenfold, but Harold remained cool, unshakable. Then he turned to leave, but just before he did, he glanced back at the hostess. She looked like she was trying to speak again, to save face, to apologize, to explain, but all he said was, "There's always time to change. But first you have to admit what you've done." And then he was gone, just like that. No yelling, no threats, just the kind of truth that echoes long after footsteps fade. The rest of the day in that restaurant felt like walking through a thunderstorm. Whispers ran wild. Staff avoided eye contact. And the manager, he was already on a call trying to figure out what kind of damage had just landed on his doorstep. But none of them knew what was coming next. They didn't know that Harold wasn't just going to audit the restaurant. He was about to make an example of it. Not to punish, but to educate, to shine a light. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with revenge. It's made with restoration and reckoning. And the next morning, a headline hit the local business news restaurant chain. Board chairman visits incognito sparks internal investigation into racial bias. Phones started ringing. Emails flooded HR. Other location managers across the region got notices. Prepare for random equity audits. And all across the city, people started talking. But the best part, the hostess still didn't know. She was about to come face to face with the full truth. And her name was now on the list. The air was thick when she walked into the staff meeting that morning. Taylor, the hostess, hadn't slept. Not really. She kept replaying yesterday's scene in her mind over and over. The man in the red shirt, the silence, the card, chairman of the board. She still couldn't believe it. How was she supposed to know he looked ordinary? But deep down, she knew that was the problem. That thought he looked ordinary kept echoing inside her, like it was justifiable, like it gave her a pass. It didn't. And she was about to find out just how much it didn't. The general manager looked pale, defeated. A regional supervisor had arrived early. Corporate HQ had sent someone. They'd cleared a conference room. The staff gathered, some grumbling, some stone-faced, all curious. No one knew what to expect. Then just as the clock struck 9:00 a.m., Harold walked in again. But this time the red polo was gone. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit, the kind that speaks louder than a business card. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just looked like exactly what he was, a man in control, a man who had built something. With him was the same woman from yesterday, clipboard ready. A new face, too, an HR executive. And behind them, cameras. Not paparazzi. Corporate documentation. This wasn't a meeting. It was a reckoning. Harold stood at the front of the room. For a few moments, he said nothing. Just looked at the faces before him. Some nervous, some ashamed. Some, including Taylor, still defensive. And then he began. I didn't come here today to embarrass anyone. But I also didn't come here to let anything slide. He paced slightly like a man teaching without needing to preach. What happened 2 days ago isn't just about one person making a mistake. It's about an entire culture, a mindset that whispers they don't belong. They're probably here to cause trouble. They don't fit our brand. Let me ask you something. He turned to Taylor directly. What brand is it that excludes dignity? Taylor didn't answer. She didn't blink. Because now there were no defenses, no excuses. Harold continued, here's what I've learned. When people think you're just a customer, they show you who they really are. But when they think you're powerful, they roll out the red carpet. That difference is everything. The HR executive stepped forward, distributing papers to each staff member. Taylor glanced down. It wasn't a termination notice. It was a mandatory inclusion training program. 3 weeks. Unpaid. With assessments and personal bias reviews. Harold nodded at the gesture. Some of you may ask, why not just fire everyone involved? Because firing is too easy. You don't change a system by throwing people away. You change a system by making them face themselves. By teaching. By rebuilding the foundation. That's harder. But it's real. The staff room was still. No one looked away. Then Harold stepped closer to Taylor. Not threatening. Not cruel. But steady. Taylor, do you remember what you said to me when I asked for a table? She swallowed. Hard. Yes. Do you remember how quickly you seated the couple behind me? Yes. Do you remember why you did that? And finally, for the first time, her face cracked. The facade, the fake smile, the practiced posture. Tears welled, not for sympathy, but because denial had finally collapsed. Because I thought you didn't belong. Silence. Harold nodded just once. Thank you. That's the beginning of truth. He didn't shout. He didn't shame her in front of everyone. Instead, he turned back to the group. Let me tell you a secret. Most people in power won't say, I've been denied, dismissed, and disrespected more times than I can count. Even now as chairman. And every time it happens, I remember some of the greatest men and women I know don't wear suits. They wear uniforms, aprons, boots, hoodies, and they carry the dignity of generations behind their backs. Now his voice deepened, not louder but heavier, so when you judge a man by his clothes, you might just be turning away the very hand that feeds you. Or worse, the hand that was reaching out to lift you up. Later that week, the story went viral. The internal investigation had revealed that the restaurant had received over a dozen similar complaints, all buried, all unreported. Harold's visit had cracked open a dam of voices that had long been ignored. Customers began sharing their experiences, some heartbreaking, some maddening. The brand responded. Apologies were issued. Policy was overhauled. But what truly mattered was this: people had seen it happen. And this time, it was on record. The day after that staff meeting, Taylor stood outside the restaurant on her break. She looked different, no longer smug, no longer guarded. She stared at the sidewalk where Harold had once stood in his plain red shirt, the same man she had deemed not worthy of a table. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I was wrong. It wasn't much, but it was a start." Sometimes justice doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes it walks in through the front door quietly with nothing more than truth in its hands. And when that happens, nobody can hide. 3 days after Harold Lawson's visit, a memo hit the inboxes of every employee in the company's southeastern region. Mandatory diversity and human dignity. Initiative Phase 1 acknowledgement and accountability. It wasn't just another corporate rebranding attempt. This time, it was personal. From the top, from the man in the red polo shirt who once stood in the lobby, invisible. But now everyone saw him, because he had made the invisible visible. At the Atlanta location where it all began, something else was unfolding. The regional director arrived unannounced and called for a second all-staff meeting. The mood was tense. No one dared show indifference. Taylor sat quietly in the corner, hands folded, not defiant anymore, just processing. The director cleared his throat and spoke directly. As of today, the following changes will be made at this location. First, a rotating equity officer will observe day-to-day service operations. Second, guest treatment audits will be randomized and unannounced. And third, Harold Lawson himself has asked to return next month as a guest. Not for business, not for review, just to dine, like anyone else. The staff stared. He wasn't coming back for revenge. He was coming back to prove a point, the most powerful kind, that respect isn't earned through wealth. It's earned through basic humanity. And then the director looked straight at Taylor. "You will personally welcome him when he returns." She nodded, eyes low, not out of fear, but of understanding. The consequences were clear. She had faced herself, and it changed her. Because true justice doesn't always come with handcuffs or press conferences. Sometimes it comes with clarity. Outside, the city buzzed on like always unaware that inside one restaurant, a kind of revolution had taken place. Quiet, surgical, permanent. Harold sat in his office that day, not gloating, not angry, just reflecting. He looked at a framed photo on his desk, a picture of his father, a janitor who raised 5 children on a single income. The caption below it read, "Dignity is not worn, it is carried." And Harold smiled, because he knew that lesson had finally been passed on. In the weeks that followed, other executives took note. Other restaurants initiated reviews. Conversations began in boardrooms, break rooms, and barbershops. What started with one man in a red shirt became a spark not to burn, but to illuminate. And as for Taylor, she stayed. She trained. She cried through some of those sessions. She heard real stories from people who looked like Harold's stories she'd never cared to hear before. One day she said something to a new hire that shocked even her. You treat everyone like they own the place, because someday they just might. And Harold, he returned. 1 month later, walked through the same front door, same restaurant. This time, in silence, the entire staff stood and greeted him not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. Taylor met him at the entrance. "Welcome, Mr. Lawson. Your table is ready." He smiled. Not because he won, but because this time, everybody did. Sometimes the people you try to shame are the very people who signed your paycheck. Sometimes the person you disrespect is the reason you even have a job. But more than that, sometimes the stranger you judge for wearing old shoes or a faded shirt carries the weight of 100 battles you'll never understand. So ask yourself, what would change if you treated everyone like they mattered? Because one day, you might find yourself face to face with someone you tried to tear down, only to realize they were always the one holding the ladder.